I accidentally found a set of keys in my husband's jacket. He said they were keys from work, but I found a garage on the other side of the city that he had been hiding. When I walked inside, it changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I was good at reading people. It was literally my job. For 11 years, I sat across from troubled teenagers in a beige office at Westfield High, watching their eyes, listening to the silences between words, catching the small tremors in their voices that told me more than anything they said out loud. I was trained to see what people tried to hide, and yet I didn't see it in my own home. Our house in Naperville was the kind of place that looked like happiness from the outside. A wide front porch, a hydrangea bush that bloomed every June, a basketball hoop in the driveway that Daniel had put up when he still thought he'd coach our son one day. We didn't have a son. We had a guest room with a treadmill and 11 years of a marriage I believed in completely. Daniel was an architect. He worked for a mid-sized firm downtown, came home at 7 most nights, made good coffee on weekends, and remembered our anniversary without prompting. He wasn't romantic in a showy way, but he was steady, or so I thought. The first sign came in February, almost 8 months before everything fell apart. He started taking his phone to the bathroom. I noticed it the way you notice a slightly tilted picture frame, a small wrongness that your brain files away and forgets. Then he began staying late at the office twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. He said there was a big commercial project in Schaumburg. I had no reason to doubt him. I didn't check. I trusted him the way you trust the floor under your feet. You don't test it, you just walk. In March, I noticed he was more careful about his jacket. He always hung it himself now, which he never used to do. Before, he'd toss it on the chair by the door, and I'd hang it. A small change, invisible almost. I told myself he was just being tidier. The second sign came in April. I found a receipt in the kitchen drawer. A hardware store, $47, 2 keys duplicated. When I asked him about it, he said they were spare keys for the office. He said the building manager had asked everyone to make copies. His voice was calm. His eyes were calm. I believed him. I believed him until the evening of September 14th. It was a Wednesday. I was looking for his gray blazer to take to the dry cleaner. There was a faculty dinner coming up, and Daniel always looked sharp in that blazer. I checked the coat closet, then the bedroom chair, then the hall. I found it folded on the top shelf of the wardrobe. When I lifted it, something heavy shifted in the inner pocket and hit my palm. A key ring. Not his usual set. Not the BMW fob, not our house key, not the office badge. This was a plain metal ring with 2 old-fashioned keys and a small rectangular tag with nothing written on it. Just a smudge of something dark like grease. I stood there in the bedroom for a long moment. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. I put the blazer back. I didn't say anything at dinner. I watched him eat. I watched him pour himself a glass of water, check his phone, laugh at something on TV. I watched him the way I watched my students, looking for the thing beneath the surface. And I thought, these are not office keys. An office key comes on a badge lanyard or a standard ring with a fob. These were old. These were deliberate. These were hidden. That night, after he fell asleep, I went back to the wardrobe. I took out the keys and photographed them with my phone, then put them back exactly as I found them. I lay awake until 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling. In the morning, I said nothing. I made coffee, packed my bag, kissed him on the cheek. He smiled and said to have a good day. I smiled back, but something had broken open inside me. Some quiet, private alarm that I couldn't unhear. I started paying attention differently after that. I checked the mileage on his car twice, once on a Tuesday, once on a Thursday. Both nights he said he'd been at the office in the Loop. The mileage said otherwise. Not dramatically, not 200 miles, just 11 extra miles one night, 14 another. Enough. Enough to know that wherever he was going, it wasn't downtown. I pulled up our shared bank app for the first time in months. I handled our personal accounts. He handled the investment portfolio and the joint savings. I never questioned it. He was good with numbers. He was an architect. He understood systems. But when I looked at the savings balance, something felt wrong. It wasn't empty. It wasn't even obviously low, but it was lower than I expected, and I couldn't explain why. I didn't confront him. I wasn't ready. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I opened my mouth and gave him the chance to explain it away, because I already knew something about Daniel that I hadn't admitted to myself until that night. He was a very, very good liar, and I had been a very willing believer. I kept the photograph of the keys on my phone, locked behind a separate passcode. I started writing things down in a small notebook I kept in my desk at school: dates, mileage, account figures, receipts I found and photographed before putting back. I was building something. I didn't know yet what it was, but I knew I wasn't going to stop. The notebook filled up faster than I expected. By the end of the second week, I had 12 entries, Tuesdays and Thursdays always. The mileage discrepancy was consistent, between 9 and 15 extra miles each time. The bank app showed a savings balance of $43,200. I knew, because I had checked an old statement I found in a filing cabinet, that 14 months ago the balance had been $91,000. Nearly $50,000 had moved somewhere, quietly, without my signature, without my knowledge, without a word. I sat with that number for 2 days before I could think clearly around it. Fear is strange. It doesn't always announce itself loudly. Mine came in at night, in the form of a particular kind of stillness. Lying next to Daniel, listening to him breathe evenly while my mind ran calculations I didn't want to make. What if I was wrong? What if there was an explanation? And then worse, what if I was completely right and I had been living inside a lie for longer than I could measure? I went to work. I sat with my students. I listened to a 15-year-old girl talk about her parents' divorce, and I heard myself say, carefully and professionally, that uncertainty was one of the hardest things for human beings to tolerate, and that moving toward information, even painful information, was almost always better than staying in the dark. I meant it for her. I needed it for myself. On a Saturday, while Daniel was at what he said was a client brunch, I made a decision. I took the photograph of the keys and drove. I didn't have an address, but I had the keys' shape, old-fashioned, the kind used for padlocks or older storage units, and I had a geographic radius, 11 to 15 miles in the direction his car drifted based on the odometer. That pointed west-southwest of our house. I spent 2 hours that Saturday driving through industrial streets and older residential blocks, looking at storage facilities, self-storage places, old commercial garages. I found nothing that day, but I came home knowing the shape of what I was looking for. The following Tuesday, I called in a personal day. I told the school secretary I had a medical appointment. Then I drove west and kept driving. I went methodically, street by street through a neighborhood near Plainfield Road, where I'd noticed a cluster of older commercial buildings on my previous drive. Tire shops, a welding supply store, a place that rented trailers, and tucked behind a chain-link fence at the end of a gravel road, a row of private garages, individual units rented separately, no company name on the sign, just a phone number and the words, "Private Storage. Units available." I parked and walked. There were 8 garage doors in a row, painted dark green, each with a padlock. I tried the keys on the 3rd one. Nothing. The 5th one. Nothing. The 7th. The lock opened. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the handle. The gravel was quiet. A crow called somewhere behind the fence. The sky was flat and white. I thought of Daniel sleeping next to me all these months. I thought of his even breathing. I thought of the $43,200 and the missing $47,800. Then I lifted the door. The garage was clean, organized, a folding table along one wall, a shelf unit with labeled boxes, a filing cabinet, gray, 2 drawers, a laptop in a soft case closed, and on the table, a yellow legal pad with handwriting I recognized as Daniel's. I didn't touch anything yet. I stood in the doorway and looked. I took photographs, systematic, careful, the way I'd been taught to document things during a crisis assessment training years ago. Wide shot, medium shot, close up, every shelf, every box label, the legal pad, the filing cabinet. I photographed the labels on both drawers without opening them. I photographed the laptop's exterior, a small whiteboard on the wall with dates and figures written in dry erase marker. And then I looked at those figures and I felt the floor shift beneath me. The numbers on the whiteboard weren't random. They were organized into columns. I recognized the format because Daniel had shown me once, years ago, how he tracked project budgets. These were account transfers, dates, amounts, and 2 destination labels. One I didn't recognize and one that said simply, PN Priya Nair was the name of a woman Daniel had mentioned exactly 3 times in the past year. A colleague, a very talented designer, he'd said, worked on the Schaumburg project. I photographed the whiteboard last. Then I closed the garage door, clicked the padlock shut, and walked back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes without starting the engine. My hands were on my wheel and they were completely steady, which surprised me. I had expected tears, or nausea, or rage. Instead, I felt something cold and clarifying settle over me like a change in weather. He had been stealing from us, not just cheating, stealing. Moving our shared money, money I had also earned, also saved, also built, into a hidden account with another woman's initials on it. This wasn't a love affair I could process privately. This was a financial crime against me, against our marriage, against 11 years of a life I had helped construct. I started the car. I drove home. I made dinner. I smiled at Daniel. I asked him how the client brunch was. And that night, after he fell asleep, I opened my laptop and searched for family law attorneys in DuPage County. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for ammunition. Her name was Catherine Brow, and she had 17 years of family law experience and an office on Jefferson Avenue that smelled like fresh coffee and old paper. I found her through a bar association referral and made an appointment for a Thursday morning, telling Daniel I had a professional development seminar in Aurora. He didn't ask for details. He never did anymore. I realize now that his lack of curiosity about my schedule was itself a kind of evidence. I brought the notebook. I brought my phone with the photographs. I brought the old bank statement I'd found in the filing cabinet. I sat across from Catherine and laid everything out in the order I'd gathered it, and I watched her face move through several expressions, attentive, then focused, then carefully still. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "The whiteboard transfers and the account discrepancy are significant," she said. "If what you're describing is accurate, and I have no reason to think it isn't, your husband has been making unilateral transfers from a joint account without your consent or knowledge. In Illinois, that's legally relevant to asset dissipation in a divorce proceeding." The word divorce sat in the room between us. I had been thinking it for 2 weeks. Hearing it out loud from someone else's mouth made it real in a different way. "What do I need?" I asked. "Documentation," she said. "Bank records. Full statements for all joint accounts going back 3 years, ideally. Any evidence of where the money went. The photographs you have are a starting point, but we'll need more than whiteboard images. We need paper trails." She told me not to confront Daniel yet. She told me to open a personal checking account at a different bank that afternoon, put enough money in it to cover 3 months of my essential expenses, and tell no one. She told me she would begin the process of subpoenaing financial records once I gave her formal authorization to proceed. I signed the authorization form before I left her office. That was Thursday, October 3rd, the point of no return, though I didn't know it quite yet. What I didn't know was that something had already shifted on Daniel's side. I found out later, much later, after everything, that Priya had noticed a change in me before I'd noticed it in myself. She had apparently told Daniel sometime in late September that his wife seemed different, quieter, more watchful. Daniel had dismissed it. But Priya was not, as I'd initially assumed, simply a passive recipient of stolen affection and stolen money. She was sharp. She had her own reasons to be careful, and she had apparently been monitoring the situation in ways I hadn't anticipated. The first indication came 11 days after my meeting with Catherine. I was at the kitchen counter on a Sunday morning when Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He was in the shower. The screen lit up with a message preview, just the first line from a contact listed only as P. She asked Renee about Schaumburg. Be careful. Renee was Daniel's assistant at the firm. I looked at the message for exactly 4 seconds. Then I looked away, and I didn't touch his phone. I memorized the words and wrote them in my notebook the moment he left the room. She was watching me. That meant they were communicating about me. That meant my window was narrowing. I called Catherine that Monday. I told her about the message. She told me to accelerate nothing visibly, but she filed the financial subpoena requests that week rather than waiting. 2 days later, I went back to the garage. This time, I was prepared. I wore gloves, not because I'd seen it on television, but because Catherine had told me very specifically not to disturb anything in a way that could be characterized as tampering. I photographed everything again, more systematically. I opened the filing cabinet this time. 2 drawers. The top held folders labeled with project names I didn't recognize, and bank statements. Printed bank statements for an account I had never seen before. The account was in Daniel's name alone. It had been opened 22 months ago. The bottom drawer had 1 folder. It was labeled in Daniel's handwriting with 2 words, exit plan. Inside was a timeline, a printed document, several pages with dates and action items. Transfer Series A complete. Transfer Series B, March. Consult attorney, asset protection, done. Illinois residency, Priya confirmed. Joint account closure, pending. My name appeared once in a bracketed note at the bottom of the last page. Mara, standard settlement offer, minimize exposure. I stood in that garage and read those words twice. Standard settlement offer, minimize exposure. I was a line item, a liability to be managed. 11 years, and I was a bracket at the bottom of an exit strategy. I photographed every page. I closed the folder, closed the drawer, locked the garage, and walked back to my car. This time, my hands weren't steady. They shook for about 40 seconds while I sat in the driver's seat. Then they stopped. I drove directly to Catherine's office without an appointment. Her assistant showed me in anyway when she saw my face. I put my phone on Catherine's desk with the folder photographs on the screen. "There's a document," I said. He called it an exit plan. It lists account transfers, an attorney he's already consulted, and a note about offering me a minimal settlement. Catherine looked at the photographs for a long moment. When she looked up, her expression had changed. "Mara," she said, "I need you to understand something. What you've just shown me changes the nature of this case substantially. This is not a standard divorce. This is a case involving premeditated financial fraud against a spouse. We're filing for divorce, and we're filing an emergency motion to freeze all marital assets. This week." I nodded. "He'll know soon," she said. "Once those freeze orders go in, he'll find out." "I know," I said. I wasn't afraid of that anymore. I was ready for it. The asset freeze was filed on a Wednesday. By Friday, Daniel knew. I was in my office at Westfield High when my phone rang, his number. I let it ring. He called twice more in the next hour. Then he sent a text. "We need to talk. Tonight." I didn't respond. I drove home at my usual time, parked in the driveway, and walked inside as though it were an ordinary evening. He was waiting in the kitchen. He was dressed as though he'd come straight from the office. Jacket still on, tie loosened, and his face was doing something I'd rarely seen it do. He looked like a man who had reached for something solid and found air. "The bank called me," he said. "There's a freeze on the accounts. What did you do?" I put my bag down on the chair. I took off my coat. I said, "I hired an attorney." He stared at me. "You hired an... Mara, what is this? Why would you do this without talking to me first?" "The same reason you transferred $50,000 without talking to me," I said. "The same reason you rented a garage I wasn't supposed to know about." His face changed. Just for a second. A flash of something raw, almost startled, before the composure came back. "I don't know what you think you found, but..." "I photographed everything," I said. "The whiteboard, the transfer records, the exit plan document, page by page." The composure didn't exactly crack, but it thinned. He sat down at the kitchen table. He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him recalibrating, the way I'd watch students do it when they'd been caught in something and were shifting from denial into a new strategy. "This is going to get very messy," he said finally. "You're making this so much harder than it has to be." "You made it hard," I said. "I'm just responding to what's already there." "He left that night to stay," he said, with a friend from work. I doubted that, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Catherine called me the next morning to tell me that Daniel's attorney had already been in contact, and that the attorney was the same one named in the exit plan document. He'd had representation lined up for months. That sharpened something in me. 2 days later, Priya called my cell phone directly. I don't know how she got the number, presumably Daniel. She asked if we could meet. She said she wanted to explain. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who had rehearsed the call. I told her I had nothing to discuss with her and ended the call. I immediately sent Catherine a text documenting the contact. Then came the letter. It arrived at the school, addressed to me personally, no return address. Inside was a single typed paragraph, unsigned. You should think carefully about how far you want to take this. There are things about your professional conduct that could become relevant in other contexts. People talk. I sat with the letter for 30 seconds. Then I put it in a Ziploc bag. I kept some in my desk for students who brought in physical evidence of bullying. And I called Catherine. "Save that," she said. "That is harassment, potentially extortion. Do not respond to it." The veiled threat about my professional conduct was meaningless. My record at Westfield was spotless, my evaluations excellent, and there was nothing there. But the fact that they'd gone to the trouble of sending it told me something. They were scared. Scared people threaten. It was practically a clinical principle. I reported the letter to the school principal as well, both to document it and because it had been sent to my workplace. She was supportive and grim-faced and said she'd loop in the district's legal team if necessary. That conversation lasted 15 minutes. At the end of it, I felt, oddly, more anchored. The antagonists had showed their hand and it was weaker than they'd wanted it to look. That weekend, both days, I did almost nothing. I drove to my sister's house in Wheaton on Saturday. Jess is 4 years older than me and has the particular quality, rare and valuable, of knowing when to talk and when to simply be nearby. We sat on her back porch and drank tea, and she didn't ask me to explain everything or put a timeline on it or feel any particular way. She just let me exist in her space, which was what I needed. On Sunday, I slept 9 hours, went for a long walk along the DuPage River Trail, and ate a real dinner, pasta with olive oil and a glass of red wine, for the first time in weeks. My hands were steady. My mind was quiet. Not empty, but settled, like water that stopped being shaken. I had done the right thing. The legal machinery was moving. The documents were documented. The accounts were frozen. I was tired, but I was not defeated, not even close. The attempt at seduction, not romantic but strategic, came in the form of Daniel's mother. Patricia Collins drove down from Evanston on a Tuesday evening, unannounced, and rang my doorbell at 6:30 with a casserole dish in her hands and a carefully composed expression of concern on her face. I hadn't changed the locks yet. Catherine had advised me to wait until the formal separation agreement was filed to avoid giving Daniel's attorney anything to characterize as hostile unilateral action. So Patricia could not get in without my choosing to let her in. I chose to let her in because she was 71 years old and I'd known her for 13 years, and some part of me was still capable of human warmth, even in the middle of a war. We sat at the kitchen table. She set out the casserole, a chicken and rice thing she'd always made for family gatherings, and poured us both water, and then she looked at me with the particular expression of a woman who has decided to accomplish something while appearing not to. "You know Daniel loves you," she said. "Whatever has happened, I know that's true." I said nothing. I looked at my water glass. "He's made mistakes," she continued. "Terrible ones. He knows that. But Mara, dragging this through the courts, the financial freeze, the attorneys, it doesn't have to go this way. He's willing to sit down, work something out between you. Something fair. Private. Something fair. Private." I recognized those words. They were from the exit plan. Minimize exposure. Standard settlement offer. Even the language was his, filtered through his mother, softened by her good faith face, but structurally identical. "Patricia," I said, "I have a great deal of respect for you. I want you to know that. But what Daniel is asking, through you, is for me to step away from legal protections that I am entitled to, in exchange for his promise to be fair. And his record on keeping promises to me is not, at this point, something I'm inclined to rely on." She started to speak. I continued gently. "He opened a private account 22 months ago. He transferred nearly $50,000 out of our joint savings. He had an attorney on retainer before I knew anything was wrong. He planned this, and then he sent a letter to my place of work that implied a threat against my career." I paused. "I'm not going to settle privately. I'm sorry." Patricia's face went through several changes. She settled finally on something sad and compressed. She said she understood. She didn't finish her water. She took the casserole back. I didn't stop her. I walked her to the door and I watched her drive away, and I felt something I can only describe as a cold, clear absence of guilt. They had tried the soft approach. They'd used someone I genuinely cared about to carry the message. It was, honestly, their best move, and it had failed. Over the following days, I became aware of a particular kind of surveillance, the low-grade, plausibly deniable kind. Daniel's car drove past the house twice in 1 week. At times he had no logical reason to be on our street. A mutual acquaintance named Greg, someone we'd known from the neighborhood association, called me to check in and managed within 3 minutes to ask whether I was still living in the house and what my plans were. I told Greg I was doing well and got off the call. I texted Catherine both incidents. She noted them. I was not afraid, exactly. More vigilant. The way you become sharper in cold weather. Not because the cold is dangerous, necessarily, but because it demands attention. The social support I found surprised me. I hadn't planned to tell anyone beyond Catherine and my sister. But on a Thursday afternoon, I mentioned some of what was happening to a colleague at school. Not to unburden myself, but because she'd asked me directly if everything was okay, and I respected her enough not to lie. Her name was Donna, and she was the school social worker, and she listened to about 6 minutes of abbreviated explanation before she said, "My neighbor just went through something almost identical. She came out of it just fine. Better than fine, actually." Donna connected me to a support group. Informal, not therapeutic, just a group of women in the western suburbs who had been through contentious divorces and met twice a month at a coffee shop in Downers Grove. I went once, that Saturday, and sat at a table with 7 women I didn't know, and by the end of 2 hours I understood something I hadn't quite articulated to myself before. I was not unusual. What Daniel had done, the hidden account, the premeditated exit, the asset maneuvering, was a recognizable pattern. These women had seen versions of it. Some had navigated it successfully. Some were still navigating. I drove home from that coffee shop at 10:30 in the evening, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness exactly, but solidity, a sense of ground beneath my feet. There were people who had walked this road before me. There were people who knew what the next mile looked like. I was not walking into the dark alone. Daniel and Priya were watching, waiting, calculating their next move. I was letting them wait. And in the meantime, Catherine was building a case that would not look anything like a standard settlement offer. They came together. That surprised me. I hadn't expected them to appear as a unit, hadn't thought they'd be willing to make their alliance that visible. But on a Saturday morning in late October, both of them were standing on my porch. Daniel rang the bell. Priya stood slightly behind him, which told me something about the blocking they'd rehearsed. I opened the door but didn't unlatch the storm door between us. Daniel spoke first. He said he wanted to apologize. He used the word sincerely. He said things had gone further than he'd intended, that he'd been in a bad place, that he still cared about me and didn't want to see me hurt. His voice had a quality I recognized from years of listening to teenagers explain things they'd done, the smoothness of a prepared statement delivered as though it were spontaneous. Then Priya spoke. She said she wanted me to understand that she'd never meant for things to happen this way, that she hadn't known at first that Daniel was still, and here she paused significantly, fully committed to the marriage. I looked at her for a moment. She was attractive and poised, and she met my eyes directly, which I gave her credit for. But the phrase fully committed to the marriage was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It was designed to plant a specific idea that she had been misled, that she was also, in some way, a victim. and that the real problem was the marriage itself, not the money, not the exit plan, not the hidden account. "I appreciate you both coming," I said. I kept my voice even. "And I've heard what you've said, but the legal process is continuing." Daniel's expression shifted. The apology face didn't disappear entirely, but something firmer moved underneath it. "Mara, think about what a trial is going to look like. For both of us. The discovery process, all our finances, everything, examined in a public record. That's going to be uncomfortable for you too." "I know what discovery is," I said. "My attorney has explained it thoroughly." "You don't have to do this the hard way," Priya said. Her tone had changed, slightly. The softness was still there, but there was an edge beneath it now. "Daniel is offering something reasonable. A fair split. Both attorneys agree to terms. 6 months and it's over. You move on. Everyone moves on." "6 months and it's over," I repeated. I looked at her. "The account he opened 22 months ago, the one with your initials on it. How long has that been part of everyone moving on?" Silence. "I'm not signing anything your attorney drafted before I knew any of this existed," I said. "I'm going to close the door now. Please don't come back to this property without going through my attorney's office." I closed the door. I heard them on the porch for a moment. A low, urgent exchange I couldn't make out. And then the sound of footsteps on the steps and a car door and tires on gravel. I sat down on the hallway stairs and let myself breathe. The fear came then. Not the paralyzing kind, but the real kind. The kind that arrives after danger rather than during it. My chest was tight. My thoughts ran briefly through a series of what-ifs that I didn't allow to expand. What if they escalated? What if they found some angle I hadn't anticipated? What if Catherine's case had a gap I didn't know about? I sat with it. I let it be there. I'd learned in years of working with teenagers in crisis that pushing fear away didn't dissolve it. It compressed it and made it denser. So I let it sit beside me on the stairs, and after about 5 minutes, it began to lighten. And as it lightened, it transformed into something else, something harder. They had come here because they were afraid, not of me as a person. They'd spent months believing I could be managed, placated, settled with a minimal check and a careful apology. They were afraid because they'd found out that I was not, in fact, manageable. The legal machinery I'd set in motion was real, and it was moving, and they could feel it. The visit had been a last bid at a private resolution, and it had failed. And now they would retreat to their attorneys and try to figure out what came next. What came next, on my end, was already arranged. Catherine had scheduled depositions for the following week. The subpoenaed bank records had arrived. The financial forensics specialist Catherine had brought in had already identified 2 additional transfers I hadn't even known to look for. I picked up my phone and texted Catherine. They came to the house, both of them. I declined and asked them not to return. No agreement of any kind was reached. Then I added, "I'm ready for whatever's next." She replied within minutes. Noted and documented. "See you Wednesday." I stood up from the stairs, made tea, called my sister, told her what had happened, kept it factual, didn't dramatize. Jess said simply, "Good, you're doing it right." I believed her. The deposition was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at Catherine's office. Both parties, both legal teams, a court reporter, Illinois discovery procedure, formal, recorded, under oath. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Voss who wore expensive shoes and spoke in the careful cadences of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room. Priya arrived separately with her own attorney, a younger woman named Alcott. The fact that Priya had retained her own counsel, separate from Daniel's, was something Catherine had flagged for me the week before as interesting. Separate counsel usually meant the parties had at least partially diverging interests. Priya was protecting herself. From what, exactly, remained to be seen. I sat across the table from Daniel for the first time in 3 weeks. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. His shirt was pressed, but there were faint shadows under his eyes, and his composure, always his most reliable tool, had a slight, barely perceptible brittleness to it, like glass that's been heated and cooled too many times. Catherine had subpoenaed 3 years of financial records, and the forensic accountant she'd retained, a woman named Sandra Park, had prepared a 70-page report that traced every transfer in and out of the joint accounts and cross-referenced them with the private account Daniel had opened 22 months ago. Sandra was quiet-spoken and precise, and when she walked through her findings in the deposition, she did so without drama or interpretation, which was far more devastating than drama would have been. 47 transfers. The total moved out of joint accounts into the private account, $74,400. Not the $50,000 I'd originally estimated, more. 22 months of carefully sized transactions, most below the level that would trigger automatic bank alerts, most occurring on Tuesdays or Thursdays. Daniel's attorney, Voss, challenged the characterization of the transfers as dissipation. He argued that Daniel had a reasonable expectation of autonomy over marital funds for business purposes. Catherine's response was to introduce the exit plan document, the full set of photographs I'd taken in the garage, and ask Daniel on the record to explain the entry that read joint account closure, pending, and the bracketed note about offering me a standard settlement offer. Daniel said he'd been exploring options. He said the document was private planning that he'd never intended to act on in the way it appeared. Catherine asked him who PN was. He said it was an abbreviation for a project name. Catherine placed a printed screenshot on the table, taken from the bank records, of a wire transfer from the private account to an account held jointly by Priya Nair and Daniel Collins at a different institution. 14 months ago, $31,000. "Does this project name have a bank account?" Catherine asked. The room was quiet. The court reporter's fingers paused for a moment. Daniel looked at Voss. Voss said something to him in a low voice. Daniel looked back at the table. He said he'd need to take a break. During the break, I sat in the hallway with Catherine and Sandra Park. I felt very calm, the particular calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of certainty. I had done everything right, every step, every photograph, every documented conversation, every letter in a Ziploc bag. When we reconvened, Daniel's answers became shorter and more qualified. He began saying, I don't recall in places where the records made non-recall implausible. His composure had thinned to something almost transparent. Then Priya's deposition began. This was where it unraveled completely. Priya, under oath, stated that the joint account she shared with Daniel had been opened for the purposes of a professional partnership between them, a design consultancy they intended to establish together. Her attorney, Alcott, looked slightly pained by this answer. Catherine placed the exit plan document in front of Priya. She pointed to the entry, Illinois residency. Priya confirmed. What professional purpose required confirming your Illinois residency? Catherine asked. Priya said that Illinois residency was relevant to business registration. When was the business registered? Catherine asked. A pause. It hasn't been yet. When did you plan to register it? After certain personal matters were resolved. What personal matters? Another pause. Daniel's divorce. The word landed in the room with a particular weight, because Priya had just, on the record, under oath, confirmed that the joint account, the money transfers, the exit plan, and her own residency confirmation were all tied to a post-divorce plan she and Daniel had been coordinating for at least 14 months, which meant the transfers were not business expenses, which meant Daniel's entire line of defense, the project abbreviation, the autonomy over marital funds, the characterization of the exit plan as personal brainstorming, collapsed in a single answer. I didn't react. I looked at the table in front of me and I breathed steadily, and I let the court reporter record every word. Voss called for another break. Alcott was already leaning toward Priya, speaking very quietly and very rapidly. Daniel was looking at the wall behind my head, and I could see him doing the same arithmetic I had done in my car in that gravel parking lot behind the chain-link fence, running the numbers, measuring the gap between where he was and where he'd planned to be, finding that the gap was far wider than anything he could manage. Catherine touched my arm lightly under the table. Not a gesture of celebration, just acknowledgement. We both knew that what had just happened in this room would determine everything that came next. The divorce settlement was finalized on a Thursday in January, 4 months after the depositions. It was not a standard settlement offer. Under Illinois law, the court had broad discretion to address marital waste, the legal term for what the forensic accountant's report had thoroughly documented. Catherine filed a motion for dissipation of marital assets, supported by Sandra Park's 70-page report and the exit plan document and the deposition transcript, and the case was not a close one. The judge, a careful, unhurried woman named Honorable Margaret Delaney, reviewed the materials and in her preliminary ruling used language that Daniel's attorney, Voss, could not soften or renegotiate around: premeditated, coordinated, and sustained. The final settlement gave me the house, fully, with Daniel responsible for the outstanding mortgage balance through a refinancing in my name only, which he was required to facilitate within 90 days. I received the full value of the dissipated $74,400 credited to my share of the marital estate, drawn from Daniel's individual assets, which included a retirement account he had not managed to move offshore in time. I received my share of the remaining marital assets, split by the court's adjusted calculation after accounting for dissipation. I kept my car, my retirement contributions, and the personal checking account I'd opened the afternoon of my first meeting with Catherine. Daniel received the contents of the private account, minus the $74,400 credited to me, minus his legal fees, which were substantial. His attorney Voss, according to Catherine, had been neither cheap nor ultimately effective. Priya Nair's situation was handled separately. Her admission in the deposition that the joint account with Daniel was tied to a post-divorce plan coordinated before the divorce was initiated had legal implications of its own. Her attorney Alcott had apparently advised her of this during the second break in the deposition, which explained the increasingly careful quality of her subsequent answers. In the months following the deposition, Priya quietly resigned from Daniel's firm. I heard through Donna at school, whose network extended in unexpected directions, that a civil complaint related to the transfer of marital funds had been filed against her as a knowing recipient. I did not follow its progress closely. That was no longer my concern. Daniel made one final attempt at contact in December, before the settlement was finalized. Not in person. A letter, this time through his attorney, asking whether I would consider accepting a lump sum slightly below the dissipation amount in exchange for a faster resolution. I asked Catherine to decline without explanation. She did. On the day the settlement was signed, I drove home from the courthouse in my own car on my own schedule to my house, in a way it hadn't been for a long time, even when I thought it was. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes, not in shock, not in grief, just breathing. The hydrangeas were bare in the January cold, just sticks against the white sky. In June, they would bloom again. I'd be here to see them. I thought about what it had actually cost me to get to this moment. Not money, though there were legal fees, real ones, that I'd handle over the following year. Not even time, though it had taken time. The cost had been something harder to name. The particular kind of grief that comes with finding out that a person you built your life around was, in some significant way, a deliberate construction. That the marriage I believed in had a shadow life I'd never been invited into. That's a different kind of loss than simple betrayal. It goes deeper. But grief and defeat are not the same thing. I had learned that specifically and permanently over the past 4 months. I called Jess from the driveway and told her it was done. She said, "I'm making dinner. Come over." I went. Catherine's bill was significant, but I paid it. I paid it in installments over 8 months, and every payment felt like a clean transaction. Money spent on the correct thing, at the correct time, for the correct reason. Some expenses are investments. That one was. I returned to work at Westfield High the following Monday. My students needed me. And more practically, I needed the routine, the rhythm of something purposeful, something outside myself, something where I could use what I knew. A girl came in that week, a junior, with a problem she couldn't quite name. I listened to her for 50 minutes and helped her figure out what she was actually afraid of, underneath the things she thought she was afraid of. I was good at that. I had always been good at that. I just needed to apply it closer to home. The June the hydrangeas bloomed. I refinished the front porch. It wasn't a symbolic act. The boards had needed replacing for 2 years, and Daniel had kept saying he'd get to it. Now I hired a contractor named Mike who finished in 3 days and left the porch even better than the original. I painted the railing white myself on a warm Saturday, listening to music through my earbuds. The neighbor from across the street, a retired teacher named Gladys, who had never warmed to Daniel, came over and said it looked beautiful. I agreed with her and felt, without forcing it, genuinely fine. The year after the settlement was not a dramatic reinvention. I didn't sell the house and move to another city. I didn't fall into a new relationship or a sudden burst of extroversion. I was still myself, a school psychologist in Naperville who drove a sensible car and kept a garden and had a sister in Wheaton. The difference was internal, and internal differences are harder to explain but more durable than external ones. I started cooking properly again, not just eating, but actually cooking, which I'd let atrophy during the marriage because Daniel had opinions about food that I'd quietly accommodated for years. I made things he disliked, spicy dishes, fish, a Vietnamese noodle soup that took 2 hours and filled the house with a smell that I loved. I ate them alone or with Jess, or eventually with 2 women from the Downers Grove group who'd become real friends. My work deepened. Having lived through something that required sustained psychological clarity in a personal rather than professional context, sharpened how I sat with students. I was more patient with the ones who couldn't name their fear. I recognized the particular paralysis that comes from suspecting something true, but being unable to confirm it. I'd been there. A year after the settlement, I was promoted to a district-level position, coordinating mental health resources across 4 schools. More responsibility, better pay. I took it. My finances rebuilt slowly and methodically. The house had appreciated. My retirement account, which I now managed myself, was properly funded. I had a savings account in my name only at a bank I chose for my own reasons, and I checked the balance regularly and without dread. I was not bitter. Anger had been appropriate and useful, and I'd used it correctly. Bitterness would have been carrying it past its usefulness. I chose not to do that. As for Daniel and Priya, I didn't follow their situation obsessively, but living in a mid-sized city means information arrives without effort. They had moved in together in a rented apartment closer to the city. The design consultancy they'd planned was registered but hadn't grown into anything notable. The relationship had developed the particular strain that tends to characterize partnerships built under high stress, high deception circumstances. What's built on sand doesn't always fall immediately, but it tends not to hold. Priya had left Daniel's former firm under conditions described to me as not amicable, and her professional reputation in the local design community had quietly shifted. Daniel was navigating a significantly reduced financial situation, legal fees, the dissipation credit drawn from his retirement account, and the expense of a new household had taken a measurable toll. He'd had advantages and spent them carelessly. I didn't take pleasure in this. What I felt was something more neutral, a quiet confirmation that reality tends, over time, to settle around the truth of things. The hydrangeas bloomed again in June, fuller than the year before. I stood on the new porch one evening with a glass of wine, watched the street go quiet, and thought about nothing in particular. I didn't take that for granted. So that's the story of the key ring I found in a jacket pocket. One small, ordinary object. One decision to pay attention rather than look away. Here is what I learned. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And find people who know more than you do and let them help. Fear is information, not a verdict. And the most dangerous thing you can do when someone is quietly dismantling your life is stay silent to keep the peace. What would you have done? Standing in that garage doorway. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. There's more to come. Thank you for listening.